evening. Welcome back to this week's segment of Dialogue Houston. I'm your host, Laurence Payne. If you've been with us for the first part of the show, we had a fascinating conversation about the Second Chance organization. Switching gears, as I mentioned in the break, we're now joined by Brandi Brown, who is with Children Defense Fund. Her long title is the Texas Youth Leadership Development Director. It really doesn't say all that she does either, but I guess they couldn't make it any longer than that anyhow. Brandi is with us because we are working on collaboratively. When I say we, a lot of organizations, and Children Defense Fund has always been the great lead in doing these things with us here in the community. Brandi gave a talk the other day at the Children at Risk's wonderful summit on education and children's issues, the future of children's issues here in Houston. And I was so impressed with it because it really was so well laid out as to point about what needs to be done from an organizational standpoint to engage not only parents but all adults in the community for the sake of children, to be voices, to be advocates for children, because we need to do that. She was actually involved through Children at Risk in a wonderful project today that I'm going to have her tell us a little bit about. And then we're going to go into this issue of engagement, of organizing adults for the sake of children's having extra voices that we so desperately need. Children don't have advocates. We don't have lobbyists. We have to be that for the children that we need. So tell us about this wonderful Children Defense Fund event today.
Sure. Today we had over 151 of our National Freedom Schools programs to participate in what we call our National Day of Social Action, really giving the children an opportunity to advocate for themselves. And this year we focused on the budget cuts on education. Oh, yes. So we know, and it was very, I think sometimes we overlook the fact that children are extremely smart and they know so much about what's going on in this country. So giving them that space where they can say education is important to me, and taking our community leaders, our elected officials back to school. We know what school meant for you.
Right,
you know what school meant for me. I was telling somebody today that when I thought about school, school was more than academics. Mm-hmm. I went to school for the social piece. Like, I love talking to people. You know, school for me started after 3 o'clock. So giving them the voice to be able to say, don't cut children. Cut those folks that you know you can cut, that have some funds that can save our education. Mm-hmm. So 151 Freedom School sites throughout the country. We had 8 of our Freedom School sites here in the state of Texas that's standing up and being a voice for not only themselves but for all of those other children that do not have that voice.
Now, what's the distinction of a Freedom School?
So the Freedom Schools is a national literacy enrichment program. We have a summer and after school curriculum or model, and this is where we go into community engagement. Children's Defense Fund, we have the model, we have the curriculum, and in order to implement that, because we're a national advocacy organization for children, we partner with organizations to implement it. So it's a 6-week free program to our families. As I mentioned to you, we have 8 in the state of Texas, 5 that are in Houston. And part of that, our theme for Freedom Schools is I can make a difference. So teaching our children that you have to start with somewhere. You can't make a difference in Uncle so-and-so if you hadn't started with yourself, right? So making a difference in self, we build onto family, community, country, and world. And this particular week is I can make a difference in my country. Wonderful. So now they're writing letters to the congressmen, their elected officials. We had several representatives to come out to our sites on today to talk to them about what budget cuts mean to them and how they can be proactive in that process.
Can any community or school work with Children Defense Fund to become a Freedom School?
Absolutely. The way that we implement our Freedom Schools program is identifying those organizations that say, wow, we have the capacity and the resources to engage our community, but we are clueless on how to do that. And so we provide, Children's Defense Fund will provide the training for them. We will provide them with the resources where they will actually just partner with us to implement it within their community.
Well, let's talk about that, because that's really what I wanted to focus on, this issue of parents and adults feeling powerless.
Absolutely.
Not engaged, don't know how to engage, don't know how to engage the system, don't know how to organize themselves. That's really one of the skill sets that the Children's Defense Fund has really laid out as important if we're going to see substantial change and growth within the public education system.
Yeah. Well, Mr. Payne, what I talk about a lot is that when we look at organizing and we look at community engagement, I mentioned at the Children's at Risk conference that sometimes we think of that as being so big that we don't take the time out to really lay out who's in in the community.
Right.
Sometimes we go straight to the parents and we forget that there are other folks in that community. They're the children, they're the churches, they're the businesses, they're the communities, but pulling those pieces together. We all have our own puzzle piece, and Children's Defense Fund is here to serve as being the convener to pull those puzzle pieces together.
So we're really looking at all adults.
All adults.
The famous Latin phrase, in loco parentis, it's not just parents.
Absolutely.
You can't just put it on the back of parents.
Absolutely.
It has to be all adults.
But we think about the movements that have taken place in this country. We think about that, yes, the parents and the adults were extremely involved, but let's really think about who can move and shake this country. And we look at high school students, we look at middle school students and college students. We know by empowering them to have a voice, then we can make some things happen. We look at the civil rights movement, for instance, I mentioned at the conference.
Right.
Then we looked at the Freedom Riders video, for instance, and kind of the basis of our Freedom Schools program is deeply rooted in the Freedom Summer of 1964. The same concepts, engaging college students to work with our communities to change that community. And I look at even that documentary that showed how college students were being trained to make a difference. I think sometimes we go into it thinking, oh, you automatically have those skills, but being trained, doing role plays, kind of being engaged in that process. And now is the time for us to start really taking community engagement and advocacy very seriously. Who are we equipping? How do we equip our parents? How do we equip our communities to make a difference on the behalf of our children?
Well, what you're really saying is focusing back on the human being.
Absolutely.
You know, we use a triangle here many times on Dialogue Houston. If you draw a triangle, put the human being in the middle, accountability at the top, personal responsibility to this side, and servant leadership to the other side. It's really us taking the personal responsibility, being accountable, and being engaged. All of us.
Right.
Children, adults, everyone. And when you reference back to a movement, the movement had that element. It had that element of personal responsibility. It had that element of not waiting on necessarily others to do for you what you can do for yourself. And I think in the engagement process that you're talking about today, and if Austin was any indication, this last legislative session, we need that more than ever.
Absolutely.
Because we appeal to people around the common good of why they should do certain things to help. We appeal to enlightened self-interest, and it still didn't get us that far. And my contention is we need a movement that is based upon the issue being couched in the language of it is a higher ethical, moral issue. It's a value statement.
Absolutely.
Just as it was in the movement in the 60s you referenced.
Yeah, and a lot of times people say, well, what's the connection? It's not, we can't see it. Then we could see it. It was black and white. There were a clear issue. And now I say, look at our education system.
But what's different?
When we look at our education system alone, Children's Defense Fund has a campaign called the Cradle-to-Prison Pipeline campaign.
Very wonderful campaign.
So looking at how many of our children are born into this country, the richest nation there is, already into this pipeline. We know there's only one way to go in and out of the pipeline. So giving them an opportunity to see what skills do we need to make sure that the 80% of Latino and African American children that cannot read at the 4th grade level, we should be outraged.
Well, again, you just said it. If you look at the demographics of who is in that pipeline, it is predominantly Latino and African American children.
Absolutely. And
so the local ALF, American Leadership Forum class, picked up the national study that you just referenced and did a local version of that, the Cradle-to-Prison Pipeline. And what we found overwhelmingly there was no surprise that, again, it is predominantly children of color that are in that system. And so if that predictor, which you referenced, which I think is one of the most telling predictors, if a child is reading below 4th grade level, that is almost a predictor that they're going to end up in the prison system. That ought to be a wake-up call to everyone in the community. And what happens? Therefore, people who are in the business of building jails and prisons look at that number and statistic, know how many kids to anticipate coming out, getting into their system, and they build accordingly.
Right. And I say, when it was the swine flu, we had every TV station, every news station. Now, every building that you go into, what do you see? You see the antibacterial dispensers there. I'm saying these are our children. Every single TV station should know. Every radio station, every community should be talking about it.
But you just hit the magic word. And that phrase that I heard too often, unfortunately, in Austin, those are not my children. So we keep saying, we and all the organizations who are fighting and advocating for children, we keep saying these are all our children. Unfortunately, you have certain segments of the population don't believe that, don't buy into that.
But I have just a spiritual background. When we look at even what the Bible tells us, it says, if you do these amongst the least of us, you've done it unto us, unto us. And so thinking about unto me, so thinking even about that, when we think about the different laws that were passed and provisions that were passed, even for a handicap, for instance, we now have sidewalks now, right? And we have those sidewalks, the ramps.
Required.
But who benefits from that? Who benefits from that? I'm a new mother. I now can roll my stroller up there, even though I'm not handicapped. You know, so we all will benefit that. If we take care of those children that cannot take care of themselves and those families that cannot take care of themselves, we have taken care of all of our children. And our national president, Mary Wright Elderman, often says that, you know, she has 4 children. And does that mean that she keeps 3 of her children with health coverage and 1 of them without? You know, thinking about just that. Do I pick and choose which one of my child does not have a good education? Or do we work together and come together and make sure that all of our children have the access that they need?
But in I and me and we and us world, that's a hard message to get across.
It is.
You know, and I think that's really the challenge we have. And we're going to take a break in a couple of minutes, but I want to set up what I want to talk about in the second part. And I think we have to be honest, we have to be realistic, and we have to be practical. In the world of the demographic changes, in the world that we live in when we talk about children in public urban education, in a world where we are living with the new unempowered majority, predominantly children of color, the movement that we're creating, and you said it so well, and I got to hearken back, it is in many ways with the schools being literally practically all resegregated again. You can walk into HIZ schools all around Houston, they're all black or all brown schools. We just, the TA just dismantled the North Forest School District, a 99% African-American school district, 7,500 kids. The movement probably is as much important now as the movement back then when we still had all segregated schools, underperforming schools, poor schools, schools that have been funded insufficiently, schools that have been funded without equality. We're almost right back there again.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So we need the movement now as much as we need it then.
Yes.
What are we going to do?
What we're going to do? We have to start. First, we need to empower and equip our families, our communities, our organizations, and our government with being advocates for our children, creating a circle of success for our children, not a pipeline. We're
going to pick up this issue as we take a break on the circle of success needed for all children to be successful. How do we equip, how do we empower, how do we engage all adults for the sake of all children? Please join us. We're going to take a small pause and break. When we come back, we're going to pick up that point.
Today is a special day. Today we gather as a nation and as an international community to recognize the selfless decision of one of the most influential women of our time. She's been recognized by religious figures and politicians around the world. To us, she's just Rachel. But to the rest of the world, she is the woman who, after having one too many drinks, chose not to drive home buzzed. Here today to honor Rachel is the family whose lives she spared.
The smallest moments can have the biggest impact on a child's life. Take time to be a dad today.
Take my hand and start a brand new day. And together as one we'll start to see some change.
Underneath everything we are, underneath everything we do, we are all people, connected, interdependent, united. And when we reach out a hand to one, we can influence the condition of all. That's what it means to live united.
Do you like this top? It's so gay.
Really?
Yeah, it's totally gay.
You know, you really shouldn't say that.
Say what?
Well, say that something's gay when you mean it's bad. It's insulting. What if every time something was bad, everybody said, oh, that's so girl wearing a skirt as a top?
Oh, you are.
Those are cute jeans, though. When you say that's so gay, do you realize what you say? Knock it off.
So here are the keys.
Congratulations, it's officially yours. I'm sure you'll have many happy years here.
Except for you, because you'll be gone 3 years from now, struck down by the same disease that got your father. So you won't be around for them. And sadly, it could have been detected early with a simple test, but you didn't have it. Okay, who wants to check out the backyard?
For a list of tests every man should have, go to ahrq.gov.
We're talking with Brandi Brown of the Children's Defense Fund on engaging a community, equipping a community, empowering a community for a movement that has to happen for the sake of our children. The key issues are engaging, empowering, and equipping those individuals. How do we do that, Brandi?
So we start. Children's Defense Fund has a great training program. I actually am a product of their program. I was introduced to Children's Defense Fund out of college, and really was equipped with the things that I needed to go to first to my church and just ask my pastor, what can we do to get involved with the children that's right here in the church?
And in our church and our neighborhood, and at school down the street from the church.
That's it. So how do we get all of those people together? And through our Freedom Schools program, the interns, we hire college students to work with our Freedom Schools programs, and we train them. We do a week-long training on how to implement the curriculum as well as youth leadership development. How do we start talking to those college students and empowering them to be the voice in their communities? We also have to be strategic in creating partnerships. We all have wonderful work that we're doing. I can say that Children's Defense Fund is the best organization in the whole wide world. However, we can't do that alone.
No,
we cannot make a difference in this country without making sure that we bring all of those tools and organizations together to make it work. So it's having that dialogue. It's talking to that church and saying, Pastor, what do you need? We know you have a heart for the people. We know we have the community.
Let's talk about that for a moment. It seems to me that urban public education has to be seen as the premier social justice issue of this decade.
I agree.
And if we start with the houses of worship, the faith communities, when we say church on Dialogue Houston, church, parish, temple, synagogue, and mosque, Children's Defense Fund in the very early stages understood the importance of having houses of worship involved. They created this whole thing around pastors of all denominations. They did the Sunday, the weekend of Friday, Saturday, and Sunday worship, where there's Children's Defense Fund's weekend around the nation.
The
Sabbath, Children's Sabbath. We prepared, because I was involved in being, we prepared homily notes and sermon notes in the discipline of each of the denominations, you know, and do we still do?
We do. Churches can still reach out to us and we can provide them with that curriculum. There's a guide that churches can have to talk about how do they advocate for children. That Children's Sabbath is observed every third Sunday now, or third weekend of the month, of October. I'm sorry, every third weekend of October.
So why don't we see if we can revive Children's Sabbath here in Houston for the third week of October?
We would love to. We would love to. And they can reach out to us at our office. I don't know if you're going to provide that number for them.
At the end of the show, it will be there.
Can reach out to us and we will do that. So looking at Children's Sabbath, also looking at school districts. We have a campaign. We talked about education today, but let's talk about health too. We talk about all of our children are suffering on so many different aspects. We look at over 1 million children in Texas do not have access to health care, and half of them are eligible for our children's Medicaid and CHIP program.
Just not
That's
in it.
a problem.
Not in the program.
It's a problem. We have to learn how to educate our families to make sure that they're a part. So Children's Defense Fund will partner with school districts, we'll partner with community organizations, and figure out what is the need for that family, and seeing if we could serve as the convener to provide them with the resources that they need. And then we also, as I mentioned, our Freedom Schools program, I will say that is one of the tools that we have that can reach not only the community, we can reach the parents, and we can reach the children, and we can reach our elected officials. Just by our National Day of Social Action today, elected officials will hear from our children and our families in that process.
Does the Freedom Schools work with the various PTAs or PTOs to try to get them more engaged? Because so many schools have the organization by name, but it doesn't do anything. It's basically non-functional. It has no really role or voice.
Well, I will tell you, with our Freedom Schools program, the only mandatory part we have of our Freedom Schools program is that the parents have to participate in a weekly meeting.
Okay.
Now, people say, well, it's 6 weeks, that's just 6 meetings.
Right.
But that's 6 meetings where we can equip our families to understand. And I had a parent to tell me that she never knew that she could just go up to her child's school without it being a problem.
Isn't that something?
So we are able to give them the tools.
Just knowing what the rights are.
Absolutely. You have a right to sit in your child's classroom, and you have the right to tell your teachers that you are the expert for your child. They're not the expert. You birthed that child. You are the expert. So really giving our families an opportunity to see that. And then we also have the training for the organizations where we can train them and say, what does this community need? Doing some community mapping, allowing them to see what's needed here and how can we pull all of those pieces together to make sure that it's successful.
I think the point you hit on about knowing what your rights are as a parent, but it's also what I've seen in working with parents and the stuff we've done is that letting know it's really an educational process of how a school district really operates and works. So many people got this thing about a school district, and the larger the district is, the more complex, but it really is a simple formula, and they all follow the same formula.
Yes.
And if you know those touch-tone points of how to access the system at the various levels that you need to within the district, then you got it. Yeah. But nobody ever tells you that. Right. The districts certainly don't educate you on that because they really don't want to be bothered with you.
Well, at one point, when we look at a couple of generations ago, education was within the community. It was a community-wide educational resource that was passed on. So it was no big deal if you saw your teacher in the grocery store or you worshiped with your teacher. It was really that teacher was an aspect of the whole family, and that education was a part of the whole family. Now education is that's what they do over there, and this is what I do at my house.
Teaching used to be a calling.
Absolutely.
That's how the teachers used to describe it. What about the paycheck?
Yeah. And now it's a job for a lot of people. Even for my peers, it's a job. They go to work every day, they get a paycheck, and they go home.
And don't ask them to do anything extra after hours on the weekends. Forget that.
You can't make a difference in that child's life like that. And we blame the parents a lot, but really it takes the whole community to do it. We say, don't blame the parents. Right. What are you doing?
Oh, no, and you can't blame the parents.
Absolutely.
I know many, particularly single mothers, who are doing the best they can. When you're having to work 2 or 3 jobs to make ends meet, and right now working 2 or 3 part-time jobs that don't pay anything anyway, you don't have time to be present at the school, to be involved, even if you want to be.
And we talk about out-of-school time, too. You know, we look at out-of-school time, for instance, you talk about families. We say a lot of times that even with our families with CHIP and Medicaid, people say, well, if they had a job, then they could get private insurance.
Right.
Well, most of our families are working families, and they do have jobs.
Even with 2 parents.
Even with 2 parents, they do have jobs, but they still need help. I had a parent to have to decide what to do with her children for the summer. She couldn't afford child care. She had a 5 and a 7-year-old. Her form of child care for the summer was going to be that she go to work every day, she leave them at home, her neighbor was going to check on them, and she would come on home on her lunch break, then go back to work and then come back, just so she couldn't have possibly afford child care. Now, for us, we would say, what trifling parent would leave that 5 and 7-year-old at home? And for her, she was saying, this was the only option I have. I cannot use my whole paycheck in putting my child in a summer program.
And speaking of even in the school year, that's why after-school programs are so important, because they fill that gap between 3 and 5 years when school is out for the parent to have a place for the child to be. We don't think of, if you don't have the need for any of that, you never think about how important that is to be able to just to be able to survive.
Yeah, and even with looking at having a program that's in place, and Children's Defense Fund is really great at being able to say, here are the tools. We're able to put the problem out there. We talk about people saying, well, those are not my children, those are their children. Well, guess what? If we don't have a safe place for those children to be, where do you think they're going to go? Whose house will they be in while you're at work? Where do you think they're going to go? So giving them, children will do things not because they're bad, but because they're children. They're curious. They want to see if they can get away with it. So having an opportunity to do that. One of the things that we also offer with Children's Defense Fund, and we don't talk a lot about it, is our Beat the Odds program. And so providing scholarships to those students who have overcome obstacles that represent thousands and thousands of children. I say all the time, if I had to go through half of the things that our children go through today, I don't know how successful I would be.
And those testimonial stories that you hear at your Beat the Odds luncheon every year is just absolutely phenomenal.
Yeah, we have actually across the state, we have a Beat the Odds program in Dallas as well as in Houston. And we've serviced, we have 12 scholarship recipients this summer. And some of them have been abused. Some of them have suffered from homelessness. And we think about these are how our children are faced every day. And what are the tools and the things that we're going to do to make sure that they will make a difference. As individuals, you know, talking about this information. We hear stuff, I said it at the conference. We're hoarders of information.
Right.
My friends think I am crazy when I give them some of the statistics. They think hearing 1 in 3 black boys that's born in 2001 has a lifetime risk of going to prison.
Right.
That sounds insane.
I know, it does.
That's a 10-year-old. That 10-year-old you're
but
looking
it's a reality.
at. It's a reality. So how do we share that information to let them know?
Children Defense Fund information is going to be on the screen in a moment where you can get hold of Brandi and Children Defense Fund. Both the phone number and the website is important that you do so because we are at a crisis. I don't know of any other way to put it. We are at a crisis and a crossroad here in Texas and this country and in Houston when it comes to understanding truly the needs of urban public education. Not the charter schools, nothing wrong against them, not the private schools, not the parochial schools. We're talking clearly and purely about the bulk and majority of our children in traditional public schools. We have to do something. We have to engage our community. It is not optional. We need a movement. It is perhaps a movement based upon what movements used to be during the 60s because we're right back demographically where we were. We have the new unempowered majority who are predominantly African American and Latino young people. The schools, if you go to any school in urban city, Houston now, HIHD, they're predominantly all one-race schools. They're resegregated again. I went to one of those schools. It's not a question of segregation or poverty. I'll put my little elementary poverty school education up against anybody's education. It is engagement. It is enlightenment. It is getting empowered, understanding the issues. We urge you to do so. We challenge you to do so. And the people who just talk about it, I always love this phrase, compassion without action is a Hallmark card. Words are not going to do it anymore. It is changing, action, behaving, having the will and the wanna. Until next week, this is Dialogue Houston. We look forward to you joining us. This is your host, Laurence Payne. As always, until then, peace, power, and love.